How are we doing? We are now approaching the midpoint in the course. And so today I'm going to give us a review. This week will be dedicated to reviewing the material we've done so far and taking the midterm exam. The midterm exam will be a number of essay questions, and I'll give you the time to actually work it out. Look at the questions, go back, review the material, write up the essay as best you can, right? As a way of getting into the issues in the course. Now, so we're halfway through the course, and as I explained at the start of the course, in some respects, even though this is listed as a history course, it's a little bit different, right? First of all, the scale is so large; it's enormous. It's really beyond my capacity. I think it beyond the capacity of most people to really to be able to control all of the details that are going on around the globe for something like 5,000 to 6,000 years, and so obviously. But I mean, this is even true of the United States, right? The history of the United States, let's face it, you could, if you wanted to, take the American Revolution and, do that. Or there are people who have written about events during the American Revolution, Washington crossing the Delaware, things like that, right? Kind of a thing. And so you can contract and pick out something and hone in on the minute details, which would certainly give you certainly a deeper understanding, but not a broader understanding. This course sort of provides you with the broadest kind of framework for understanding human history since its origins. And as such, it sits on the borderline between history and prehistory. If you recall, I suggested that writing is the cultural construct that makes possible contemporary academic history, which is to say, the historian, working at whatever, right, at UConn, the historian working at UConn will sit down and read what are called secondary sources, which are the writings of the historians who have gone over the material and come up with certain things, right? But that person will then move into the primary sources, which are the written documents from the period of time, right? So for example, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, over their lifetimes, exchange letters. And those letters are now documents to the mentality of two of the founding fathers, who sort of will eventually face off in the third presidential election, where Adams is defeated by Jefferson, and but they will maintain friendships and all these kinds of things, right? So what I'm suggesting is you can use a microscope, or you can look at the galaxy through a telescope. This is more a telescope kind of course, and so we don't have the time to get down and dirty too much, right? But I would hope that you understand the connections and the patterns at a deeper level. So, prehistory then is the field par excellence of what's called archaeology. And the archaeologists are the guys who go in, guys and gals who go in, and they've developed all kinds of scientific techniques, but go in and try and recover the remains of past civilizations as a pathway to trying to understand that civilization. Problem, of course, is those civilizations may or may not have had writing systems involved with them. And since we sit right on the borderline between before and after, some of the material we're dealing with really represents the contribution of the archaeologist. Some then may be closer to contemporary ideas of what constitutes academic history, relying on written sources or perhaps other kinds of sources, right? Things like paintings on the walls, statues, stuff like that, right? Kind of a thing, right? Um, so we'll be looking at, and we have already looked at it, some of the examples of the earliest forms of writing that exist, and we'll get to that in a second, right? But we're going to be relying on archaeology to a certain degree. But I think what the textbook does a nice job of doing is indicating that the boundaries between, what you were told you should do and what you may do in today's world, where you can then rely on other disciplines and other discoveries to the extent that they enlighten us about events in the past. Why not? So, as we saw in the discussion in Guns, Germs, and Steel, okay, let's look at carbon-14 dating. How does that serve the historian, right? Can it be better served by newer, more advanced physics techniques that then take us a little further and a little more exactitude, right? And these kinds of things. And after all, being able to sequentially date events in the past is an important contribution of history because causes should precede the effects, right? And so we have to get our sort of our ducks in a row. I have a friend who uses that expression. As a Long Islander and sort of New York City kid, I'm not real comfortable with it, but that's what we have to do is get our ducks in a row, right? Okay, so history, archaeology will rely on physics to date the artifacts, what they discover, the remains. Geology, as we see in the book, will also be used to help sort of follow the climatic shifts, the changes in the environment that have occurred over time, and recent advances in that regard, certainly in the opening chapters, provide us with a unique point of view there, right? That we discover that climate shift around the year 2150, something like that, that apparently is rather widespread, is going to have an impact on these earliest civilizations because they are so closely tied to the environment for their survival that a climate shift as occurs there. So here we have that. Then we have genetics, right? And so the kinds of things that Jared Diamond was talking about, which is of interest to the archaeologist, right? If you find preserved somewhere from 6, 7, 8,000 years ago grains, well, now with the modern techniques of genetics and biology, you can determine whether those grains were wild or sown. Were they planted or simply harvested growing wild in the field? And as we see, that's, for a certain aspect of the story that we're looking at here, the origins of civilization, that distinction is relatively important, right? If you can determine whether what you found is wild, you may assume, it's not 100% definitive, but you may assume that they don't have farming yet. If they do have seeds that demonstrate that they have been domesticated, well, we know we're on a situation where the food production revolution has begun. How deeply it's penetrated, as Jared Diamond indicates, will depend on where you are, how deeply it goes, how long it would have taken to make the transfer to it, things like that. Even my own field, anthropology, cultural anthropology, has had something of a role to play, perhaps peripherally, but the level of sort of cooperation between the different fields of the social sciences. The textbook is an example of sort of the end results when you open up the storehouse of discoveries that we've made by people working in divergent areas, but that all have something important to say in the final analysis. So, for example, and I think I might have mentioned this to you when we were talking about hunter-gatherers, right? Well, hunter-gatherers as a way of life was studied by cultural anthropologists during the 20th century as they were reading the writing on the wall that said they ain't going to be around too much longer. We'd better go out and try and determine, if we can, um, you know, just how their way of life is put together and what the parameters are and their understanding and things like that. And so anthropologists have worked very hard, and of course archaeologists then can sort of use judiciously, carefully, can use the results of those studies to turn around and sort of give flesh to archaeological findings about hunter gatherers. And you can imagine, the further back in the past you go, the less you expect to find in terms of artifacts and remains, things like that, indications of the size of the group, how they lived, what they hunted, what they ate, how they interacted with the environment, with each other, things like that, right? And so those anthropological studies that have indeed been done to really sort of analyze as deeply as possible the richness and diversity of contemporary hunter-gathering groups and their way of life is the kind of thing that can help inform and provide us with possible clues to the puzzle of just how it is our ancestors lived 10, 15,000 years ago. Not that there can be a definitive one-to-one correlation between what they discovered in the 20th century and of necessity how people lived in the past. Nevertheless, there is a convergent body of fact that can be useful in this regard. And so with that as preface, we jump right in at the end of the last ice age, maybe 15,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, depends upon who you look and what you're looking at. But of course, the end of the ice age corresponds to a period of warming in the climate, in the environment. And that warming is also going to, because it's melting the ice, is going to increase the amount of humidity in the air. And so this combination of heat and humidity is going to feed the growth of flora and fauna in the environment, which will lead then to an expansion of human groups that live directly off of the produce of nature itself, right? So there is a period of time there, and it's really not a central part of the course, but a period of time in which hunter-gatherers take advantage of the renewed resources in the environment to grow their population and also to create sedentary villages, villages that stay in a certain area. If there are sort of constant renewable sources of food in the environment that occur naturally. And so we began to move from a more nomadic form of existence for hunter-gatherers to hunter-gatherers that either, semi-annually will move. Here on Long Island, there were groups that in the summers came down to the shores and shellfish. We found mountains of the shells that were husked and eaten by these groups. They'd come together during the summer months. In the winter months, they'd move into the interior of Long Island, slightly higher. There were deer there, right? And so they relied on hunting deer. And so you have this kind of combination of things beginning to happen. But we're much more interested then in what happens when it begins to dry out again. And people find that their own population has grown, and indeed their own techniques for hunting have improved with the introduction of better better arrowheads and spearheads and things like that. And so there is this sort of like constant tension between the richness of the environment and the growth of human populations, where humans are not contributing but subtracting. And you get to the point where alternate strategies, as Jared Diamond would refer to them, well, alternate strategies begin to take their place, where women learn that they can drop seeds in the field, and when they come back, 8 months later to that same spot, they will find the plants growing, and they can harvest, without actually having farmed them. But you can see it's kind of like the first step into it, right? And so it will take, as both the text and Jared Diamond indicate, a period of several thousand years from the first experiments in domesticating plants and animals to a full-fledged farming style of life, where people are now dedicated to staying in a certain place and putting all their eggs in one basket, and relying then on, if you will, farming as a standard way of life, right? At that point in time, most of human energy would be directed to farming, as their techniques developed, as their sort of their knowledge and skills in the area began to grow and expand. They would then have gradually begun to grow their populations, so that at a period of time, somewhere in the vicinity of, say, 6,000 6,000 before, BC, something like that. You begin to get villages growing into towns, where a town will distinguish itself from a village because its population is large enough to sustain something like a marketplace once a week, something like that, right? You begin to get the emergence of specialists, like that person who can produce ceramics, a critical element for agriculture at this point in time, because you have to both grow adequate seeds to feed you for the year, but save then some to plant the next year, right? And these things. But there does seem to be, because people at that point in time, so we're looking at, say, 6,000 BC, what's that, 8,000 years ago. We're looking at a period of time in which agriculture, farming as we know it, was really rainfall agriculture. And rainfall agriculture confronts all of the vagaries of the rains, that come and go and hit and miss, and these kinds of things, right? And so there are sort of limits placed on just how far you can take this system of farming to grow populations into a higher level, that leap to civilization that we're really kind of looking at here, right? And that kind of leap forward, if you will, is associated with the next stage here, which is riverine civilizations. And riverine civilizations are sort of like the point at which it really takes off, right? There must have been, systems of management and organization and things like that, and sort of like tribal understandings and how you should behave and stuff like that. But riverine civilizations are just going to take this vast leap forward. Let's review very quickly what they have, right? And so what's special about riverine civilizations, And by that term, we mean what the text actually calls river basin civilizations, right? Um, what's special about them is um, people who have been practicing rainfall farming come down to the banks of the rivers and discover, and not without a lot of work, but discover that indeed there is in the river basin itself, there is a unique constellation of elements that will sort of explode the productivity of agriculture. You know, and I know you know this already, but this is a review, so I'll run through it rather quickly, right? And so we have, well, the first thing is we have the river and the water. And rivers tend to be seasonal. They're often fed by melting snow on the tops of mountain ranges in the interior, have to travel then down to the sea. As they go, first they can start as rain on the sides of mountains and into little streams, down into, larger streams feeding into smaller rivers. And along the way, they're going to pick up a lot of mineral content that they carry in the water that we refer to as silt. And of course, silt is, shall we say, um, provides the material basis for the growth over time of extremely deep, rich, fertile soils on the banks of the rivers themselves that have been have been flooded for millennia, right? And each time the river floods over and takes the muck from the bottom or whatever, right? All the silt it's carrying in itself, and it spreads that water over the land, sunlight beating down on it, it melts, no, it evaporates and sort of seemingly melts down into the soil. And so that silt that's carried in the water is then deposited on the soil and over centuries has created a treasure box for people coming in who discover that, wow, this is great. So you have the water with the silt providing then the next element, which is this extremely fertile soil. And the final element is sunlight itself, right? All of the different examples like this are going to be in regions that also have um, sort of very dry periods of time where sunlight is baking down. But if you have plants growing and they're getting water from the river through irrigation systems, but that's the phrase there, right? Hydraulic systems designed to take the water from the rivers, channel it around, and spread it out so that everyone gets their fields irrigated. And that combination of elements then produces what we refer to as surplus. A single farmer, or a farmer's family, shall we say, can, working the fields in these riverine environments, can produce 4 to 5 times the amount of food that his family would need. And if you have that extra food, well, then, and we don't want to get into the right now in this generalized discussion, but you have extra food, you can feed people who are not working in the fields. And I have sort of used the term food dependent population, which is a bizarre term because I openly admit, look, we're all food dependent, right? And I don't eat and I'm hungry. I don't do this very well. Hopefully I am doing it well, but you know what I mean, right? This expression means specifically surplus production in the fields makes it possible for people to practice other things than simply working in the fields to survive. We can now create specialists in a variety of areas who will rely on the food that is being produced by others working in these high intensity kinds of situations that produce more than is needed, right? Now, again, um, when I look at this, I look at it from the point of view of, the horse and the carriage which goes first, and the chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? Um, because most people will say, well, of course, these people are the governors, and they will just force people to pay them. But of course, at the start of the system, when this is just beginning, um, I don't have an army, I don't have police, I don't have anything like that. I probably don't have a legal system, right? Um, and yet, if I'm going to sit on my butt in an office someplace, um, I must be insured of the fact that there is a system in place to provide food to me and my fellow, um, whatever, priests in the temple, ruling class, right? Whatever. Even teachers in schools, because there are teachers at schools going on in these early places as well, right? And so for me, it's a little bit of a mystery, right? Just how you kind of get it started. And one of the keys for me as an anthropologist is the figure of the shaman, that person who combines two what we consider to be separate occupations, the priest and the healer. And we don't want to get into that again, but the shaman then is the type of person that could have been like a specialist amongst hunter-gatherers, because he practices the sort of the intellectual division of labor, where knowledge is power. He or she, for that matter, right? Either one. It's not really determined by gender, but that person who has demonstrated healing properties can often reduce the amount of work that they put into food gathering because others bring them offerings. If that's the case, then as you move from agricultural villages down to the riverside, right, the shaman may indeed be that person who first establishes contact between the people in the fields and the people in the inner core, who need that to survive, right? And that may certainly be the case in Mesopotamia, that we will get to in just a second. Okay, so let's jump right into Mesopotamia. The first example in the book, and usually first one that is referred to as the first example of a complex system, a complex society, and Mesopotamia, but particularly the Sumerian city-states. And Mesopotamia has that special dynamic that over the centuries, it will gradually move further north, up the Tigris and Euphrates, till the point around the year 2000, where the Sumerian city-states, the sort of the origins of civilization, have been sort of surpassed by groups to the north that are able to sort of bring warfare and violence into the equation and conquest, and hence surpass the city-states, because what the Mesopotamians did, the Sumerian city-states, that was unusual, is that each of the individual city-states, which has something like an urban core, might not look so much like an urban core to us, but it was their urban core, and then is surrounded by an area of land that is cultivated. And that food from that area of land surrounding the city is what enables those people who have specialized in particularly the priestly class. Later there'll be, a king of sorts who comes in, right? Government officials, um, shall we say, an upper class developing, um, those fields will then provide the people in the cities with food. But surplus production being what it can also be used in the form of exchange with other groups. In this case, nomadic groups, herders, pastoralists, carrying taking care of sheep and goats and things like that, and bringing them in for sale into the marketplace, since they're not, the Sumerians will rely on these nomadic groups for protein, animal-based kinds of protein there, right? Let's take a look at this a little bit more closely then. So each of the city-states apparently was established around an initial altar and were dedicated to a god right from the start. And indeed, those altars will grow into temples, which were considered the homes of the gods. They didn't have, apparently, um, places where people just came in off the street to pray and things like that. Rather, there were statues of the gods, and particularly of the high god of that city. And they would, the priest who took care of them um, would receive offerings from people, and leave offerings to the gods. They'd end up eating the offerings themselves and stuff like that, right? But the fundamental sort of magnet at the heart of this earliest society is religion, religious beliefs, the fact that each of the city states is dedicated to an individual god. Eventually, they'll morph into places that have, that really grow into larger cities with an increase in population. And we'll end up having things called ziggurats, right? Those sort of step temples, almost like step pyramids, closer in some respects to what you might have had, say, amongst the Mayans and other groups in the Americas, because these ziggurats apparently were filled inside with dirt, covered on the outside with baked bricks to last, had stairways that went up to the upper reaches, and apparently only the priestly class could go up there into those reaches, right? Okay, so what do? They develop for us the first earliest writing system, cuneiform, and it would appear that, well, first of all, as you know, cuneiform is taking a wet clay tablet, a reed stylus cut off, so it's kind of squared at the end, and just sort of dipping it in the wet clay to leave marks. And those marks then were like a writing system that produced words and languages. And the earliest use of that seems to be some sort of bookkeeping for the temples themselves to keep track of who had who had contributed what, who had taken what, just a way of keeping track of because after all, food was wealth at this particular point in time, right? There were 12 major cities. Not all of them last the whole period of time, and a couple of them, like Ur, will become major cities and more powerful than others, right? They also tended to have markets for trading. As I said, groups would come in and bring things with them, and they became sort of centers on migratory pathways for people with, with their sheep and goats, but others as well eventually will be coming in with camels and carrying other kinds of stuff in. They actually had schools, so that people could learn how to read and write the cuneiform. And the cuneiform will morph over time into much more a true writing system. Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was actually recorded in cuneiform. Now, The Tigris and Euphrates was a two-river system, and there was a great deal of challenge involved in this system. For one thing, they flooded in an erratic fashion, didn't appear always at the same time, and sometimes the water would be less, sometimes it would come down and flood them out. And so it did take them a period of time to sort of, shall we say, tame the rivers to the extent that they could, create canals and pathways, ways of bringing water into the land and creating a pond that they could then use to irrigate the fields with. Um, they had another challenge in that the rivers would flood at the wrong period of time, and that was a challenge. So if it floods early, then we have to keep the water in some sort of a protected area, like with a dam, and you have a little basin of water behind it, because you don't want it on the field at the wrong time, but you do need it later on the field, right? These kinds of things, and so there was a lot of work involved there, right? Producing this hydraulic infrastructure. Now, as I mentioned before, around the year 2000, then we already had Sargon of Akkad, 2350, will come down, the first conqueror to come down out of the mountains to the north, speaking Akkadian, a Semitic language. But his Akkadians will rule for 150 years. When they break down, Ur rises up. We have that, the dynasty of Ur. When that collapses around the year 2000, is the end of that period of time, in the true sort of origins with the Sumerian city-states. And that's when we're going to move up north to cities like Babylon, right? And the Semitic speakers then sort of begin to take over. How are we doing for time? Okay, so we're going to jump into Egypt. Egypt, as we know, has a single river, the Nile. People probably began arriving there somewhere between 4,000 and 3,000 BC. It's going to be much less work, and apparently, given the fact that it's on both sides of the river and rather extensive, people went down and formed small villages and villages and villages until finally, around the year 3200 BC, Narma, the king from the Delta regions, conquers the southern regions going up, and creates a unified kingdom. And what we have then is the onset of pharaonic monarchy, where you have a pharaoh as a king with a dynasty, with the son of the pharaoh coming in to take over when the pharaoh dies. And again, this is all tied to a host of certain ideas. What I've suggested to you, and I've brought in the figure of the shaman as well, is that shamans would have observed the skies. And we've seen this in studies done, that, this commonly held belief that the skies, the heavens, as we call them, is the realm of the gods. And if the shamans are talking to the ancestors and the gods, things like that, they would have indeed studied the stars and the movements of the stars, things like that, such that as people move down around the rivers, people like that, an incipient beginning priestly class is going to study the sky and begin to correlate the movement of the stars in the heavens with the rising of the water in the Nile. And it gets to the point where they actually are good enough to be able to predict it, and be able to announce to the people, get ready. Next week, the waters will start arriving, right? And knowledge indeed is power. And they will benefit from this and ultimately create a figure, the pharaoh, who is credited then not just with predicting, but with intervening with the gods that be to ensure that the waters rise. And they will, craft around the figure of the pharaoh, rituals, public rituals that demonstrate to the population at large that the bounties of the Nile are indeed a direct gift of the pharaoh. I consider it one of the greatest ideologies, political ideologies, a system of ideas to support a political order that ever existed. I mean, how can you bite the hand that feeds you? If the Pharaoh is the person who guarantees that the rivers will rise, and the Nile is the richest area on the planet, why revolt? Why give? Why? What good would it do if you were to revolt against the Pharaoh? Well, the hand of God would smite you down, and the next thing you know, you wouldn't have waters. You wouldn't have, the bounty of the Nile. As the Greeks said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile, right? And if you destroy the Nile, if you destroy the Pharaoh, you destroy the Nile. Hence, pharaonic dynasties will continue to exist. And when one line dies out, another one will take over. And this is one of the places, and I like what the textbook does with this. This is one of the places where the introduction of external sources of information, growing knowledge about climate shift on the planet, has sort of helped us put together the pieces of the puzzle as to why dynasties would fall, and there were what were called interdynastic periods, because it turns out that these interdynastic periods are correlated with the onset of climate change, which certainly means, and indeed later on, there will be written documents, poetry, and things like that to demonstrate the fact that there was chaos and confusion caused by the fact that the Nile wasn't running anymore and people were starving, and suddenly, right, what had been a viable way of life seems to be threatened. And ultimately, as hard as the Pharaoh will try, he can't really change the elements. So dynasties fall. There's chaos and confusion until what happens again? The waters start to flow again. Since at that point in time, they really had no idea of the whole sort of um, uh, internal plumbing of Africa, such that at a certain point in time, waters from all the way down in Lake Victoria in the south, right, are going to start moving north. And eventually, the two Niles will join together, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, in Sudan, and then the flood will hit Egypt, right? And these kinds of things. Now, okay, so we already mentioned the fact that Mesopotamia, which was built right from the start, from the earliest, those Sumerian city states, when archaeologists went down to ground zero, right when rock, where it began, it began with some sort of an altar, which is to say that religion and indeed the priestly class, the shamans, would have had a fundamental role in bringing their people down to settle in these areas. And then gradually, as the city grows, so does the temple that is the home of the gods. Well, you don't have exactly the same thing happening, although you do have temples up and down the Nile River. And what seems to have happened, and is reflected in some of those marvelous images of god men with, the heads of birds and things like that, is people from a variety of areas were drawn into the Nile region, the Nile River region, as the deserts spread, as the Sahara began to spread and force both game and hunters to the river's edge, and from the other side as well. And so it would appear that the arrival of these different people from different areas who settled in specific areas then created their own temples to their own gods that they brought with them and thought were protecting them, things like that, right? Now, if indeed, okay, one thing I want to say before I continue with that is Um, when you look at the geography of Egypt, Egypt is very different from Mesopotamia because the Mesopotamian city states have really no great natural barriers to defend them from outside invasion. They are the first ones to get started, so there isn't, if you will, um, large consolidations of populations that could invade and attack them. But they are right from the start in contact with Bedouin groups who come in and use their markets and things like that, right? Egypt, on the other hand, is totally circumscribed. It's like this island paradise sitting in the middle, you know, in the middle of the African continent. Not exactly, but you know what I mean, right? Um, and so it has the Sahara Desert to one side, desert to the other side that extends over to the Red Sea. Um, uh, it has coming out of Africa, out of Sudan, the river itself turns into a series of cataracts and waterfalls that would have made it impossible for an invasion by boat down the river to come, right? Um, and at the other side, then you have the Mediterranean Sea, which certainly at the start of this there were no massive civilizations, as will arise, as we will see with the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, others. But that's for another day, right? The So Egypt will be sort of like an isolated island, able to grow and develop its own culture internally. It's not till after that collapse of civilization around the year 2000 that they are then prone to outside invasion, which also ties in with the emergence of other kinds of groups and new technologies, specifically um, chariots with horses, right, that suddenly make them sort of um, vulnerable to attack by outside groups. Now remember, we looked at cuneiform. The writing system in Egypt is the infamous hieroglyphics, sacred writing, and it tended to you tended to find this form of writing on the walls of temples, inside the pyramids, on the walls of the pyramids, and effectively it was a writing system designed to communicate with the gods, and was really meant for the eyes of the gods. So inside pyramids, you will find a text that will outline for you the achievements of the Pharaoh, right? Because the angel of death is coming, and we'll get to read the achievements of the Pharaoh, and sort of accept the Pharaoh into divine company, because at death the Pharaoh then is believed to sort of become a star in the heavens, based on the life that he lived, right? Um, Now, the Egyptians also have a strong sense of life after death, um, and particularly for the pharaohs, as I mentioned, he will take his place among the gods. Um, so much of this is tied to the fact that in a single river system like the Nile, you really need to have a strong hydraulic system so that people upriver are not depriving people downriver, and so that it can be coordinated and controlled. We jump over to the Indus River Valley, which develops around the year 2500 to about 2000, the so-called Harappan civilization. Very, very interesting because it's somewhat mysterious. For one thing, it covers the largest landmass of any of these, more than Egypt, more than Mesopotamia, and it seems to be, in some respects, kind of a derivative civilization that took the cultigens that had started in the Fertile Crescent, and then added to them a few things from local on. But what they did was they created a civilization based on commerce and trade, right? And the great mystery of it is the degree of unification that existed seemingly that the archaeologists can observe, and yet there is no writing system. There is no clear example of there's no writing system, no clear example of political power. There's no palace, no kings, things like that. Cities in different areas are established with the same grid-like system, like in Manhattan, right? Avenues and streets and this kind of a thing. But going beyond that, whole neighborhoods dedicated to artisans doing specific kinds of work in products that we will then find in Mesopotamia and the city-states of Sumeria, right? And so they were trading then with this great civilization over there. And they had developed a whole way of life based on that, but with obviously feet in the sand. They also had agricultural sites around their cities as well. So they were a riverine civilization. Now, we haven't been able to decipher what little appears to be writing there. So we don't have a writing system, so we don't have documentation. So it's so hard for us to tell exactly what's going on there, right? But they had unified weights and measures spread throughout the country, right? So that you could go anywhere and buy a pound of, or whatever it was, right? That system had been codified and universalized throughout, right? In any case, it is both interesting, somewhat derivative, but also mysterious, because if there is no writing and there is no political unification, how is it that these cultural systems are found so unified? Is this an example of a civilization that is founded on commerce and trade, and that who knows that the merchants themselves were the ruling classes there? These are things that sort of remain to be seen, right? Because we just don't have it, and I'm not sure that there'll be more sources of information, but you can never rule that out. The last area we want to look at quickly here is China, right? The Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers providing a dual river system, somewhat like the Tigris and Euphrates, but much broader apart, and so more like two separate systems running through them. Now, in looking at it, and I tried to go over those different things in the last two lectures, right? The first of the last two lectures, that there were two separate cultigens involved here, and indeed two regions based on the differences between these two. So we have rice, primarily in the south, in the wetter, warmer southern regions, spreading all the way across, southern China, into Japan, Korea, into a variety of places because of rice's ability to sustain population. It can give you several crops in a single year, done correctly, right? But then there's a whole nother part of the country, the northern sort of upper, higher land regions that are drier, cooler. The land is harder. And for that particular region, we have something called millet, which is a little bit like wheat, you might regard. It's a grain, and it grows on a very, very long stalk that looks like a bit like corn. But of course, corn grows on stalks, and then it has ears that come out. This flowers at the top and converts into grain. But it can be used, it can be ground and made into something like a bread or pancake kind of a thing. It can be, they can make beer out of it. You can ferment it and make beer out of it. So it will actually be the millet-based society that emerges first in the northern regions. And the earliest indication is something called the Hsia, Hsia dynasty, which is, supposedly around the year 2200 BC, but archaeologists have never been able to find real concrete evidence that this actually existed. It may have existed as some sort of a confederation of tribal groups where there's a tribal leader who may be elected by the different groups, but we really don't know. And it exists in sort of these classical Chinese history books that were written years later. I mean, centuries later. So how they actually, other than sort of, the stuff that, say, Homer does in writing the Iliad and the Odyssey about events that occurred 400 years later. Well, if they were part of popular myth and legend, and stuff like that, right? But the first true civilization that emerges here is the Shang Dynasty. And it is located in a northern stretch in the Millet region. It is the oldest dynasty with a clear archaeological record, unlike the Shia. It develops a writing system. And what is fascinating about this writing system is that we know of it because of something called oracle bones. And oracle bones were the scapulas of cattle, of deer, and they're plate-like kinds of bones, or the why do I always forget this? Okay, I forgot it when I was writing down, so I couldn't write it down. But from the the shells, the turtle shells, right? Turtle shells. Anyway. Why is this interesting? Well, in China, then, you have something called ancestor worship. And so ancestors are very, very powerful spiritual figures that are sort of aware of us and what we do, and whether we respect their memory or not, right? Whether we perform the correct, individual houses have altars to the ancestors. And this is something that is still true in China today. It's one of these foundational cultural constructs, if you will. The oracle bone is directly related to the idea of ancestor worship because the oracle bone, in the hands of the sort of the priestly class that is doing this, the oracle bones are able to transmit questions to the spirit realm, and the spirits will respond to those questions through a rather bizarre interaction with them, in which you take a bone, whatever, and you scratch a question on it. You put the bone on top of a metal bar that has been heated up in fire so that it's very hot, which will force the bone to crack. And of course, the experts in reading the cracks are the scribe slash priestly class of people who will then read and write the results of it. We have found then in the royal cemetery for the Shang Dynasty a whole trove of these, an immense amount of these. And once we discovered them, we realized that they had writing system. This writing system is seemingly moving in the direction of classical Chinese writings. And briefly, classical Chinese writing is a system that creates an image of an idea, an ideograph, a graph of an idea, rather than a writing system, as we understand it, with letters and sounds creating words and and all that. They have one where you just you construct you construct the written form by choosing from the the storehouse of acceptable forms, and you do that. And one author, one very prominent author, has said, if you want to understand why Chinese society has been so conservative, He said, it's hard to take an image that is encrusted with all the meanings of the past and somehow use that same word in a new fashion to create new ideas. In any case, we want to tie the Shang dynasty to oracle bones, the writing system that they are developing, the idea of ancestor worship, but also um, one of the major factors of the Shang dynasty is the emergence of bronze, um, combining copper and tin, maybe with lead, a few other things, to create a metal that is much harder than copper that had been the previous metal used by the Longshan, people who preceded the emergence of the Shan, right? And of course, bronze serves as weapons. It will also be tied to the idea of chariots, horses, warfare, and they will then be a conquering and warring people. But as the text shows you, with capitals that seem to move here, there, and everywhere. And so there are like 5 or 6 different capitals as the sort of the threat from outside groups either diminishes or increases, diminishes and you move further in that direction towards them, or if they suddenly get strong again and threaten you, you move away from them. In any case, this is the last of the, indeed, riverine civilizations to look at here and the emergence of it. I will be putting up the 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 test um, in the next couple of days with directions and everything with it. Okay, this went a little bit longer than I wanted. Okay, sorry guys.